Hello, all. I'm Jewel Clavin, a Connecticut teacher and a student at Eastern Connecticut State University. Today, I'm going to talk to you about ethics and new media literacies and whether or not it presents a challenge or a solution for our students. So, there's three main concerns when it comes to digital media and digital literacy, according to Jenkins. The first is called the participation gap, which basically means not all students have equal access to technology and aren't equally educated about how to use that technology. The second problem is called the transparency problem, which relates to students' inability to transfer their knowledge of technology to the ability to critically analyze the technology in the digital text. Lastly, and most importantly, I think, is what's called the ethics challenge, which logically refers to a student's struggle to apply ethics to digital media. So there's a lot of research that discusses this struggle, but as educators, we might be able to use it to our advantage to teach ethics in the media. And as consumers of digital information, our students are exposed to so much content on a daily basis. So one look at Snopes shows how people struggle with what's real and what is fake. Examining ethics in the media is definitely a necessity of our times. So in 2016, the term post-truth was Oxford Dictionary's word of the year. And it basically means circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion or personal belief. So it shows that people value opinions and emotion much more than facts, objective facts, as of late. In 2017, fake news was added to dictionary.com, and we all are familiar with the term. It used to refer to a small amount of sources whose content was often so absurd you didn't even need to fact check it. But that's changed a little. Now, first of all, those sources are not as easy to identify as being false, fake. And also, fake news has even morphed to mean just news that we simply don't agree with, that contradicts our values or opinions. And it's increasingly hard for people to consume digital media in an ethical way because it's increasingly hard to identify whether or not it's a reliable source. So if you check out this video on the newest deepfake technology, it demonstrates that it's not necessarily an easy thing to do.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time.
Jordan Peele created this fake video of President Obama to demonstrate how easy it is to put words in someone else's mouth.
Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet.
Not everyone bought it, but the technology behind such frauds is rapidly improving, even as worries increase about their potential for harm.
So it's difficult to determine whether or not a source is reliable, and we definitely are not the best when it comes to consuming digital information. In fact, around 55% of millennials and Generation Xers trust Facebook as their primary source of news, which is concerning because Facebook doesn't necessarily have those safeguards that other reputable news sources do. And individuals 65 years and older are 7 times more likely to share fake news than those of us in the 18 to 25 age range. And people often avoid information that challenges their established beliefs. That means that they produce or share or consume news that just keeps us isolated in our thinking. It's a phenomenon called confirmation bias. So there are definitely other issues with ethical and digital media. So there's theft of intellectual property, online harassment and bullying, online deception, and sharing of private information, which all requires the use of moral and ethical thinking to make good decisions. So our students are being forced basically to make ethical decisions every day, but they aren't even aware of them. So the nature of the digital sphere has ethical implications, unlike the decisions we made when we were younger, before this was a digital society. online communication has the trait of, first of all, persistence, which means that things don't disappear easily. They can come back to haunt you. In addition, it's also super easy to access that information even years down the line, and that's called searchability. And lastly, and most importantly, is that digital communication has what's called scalability. In other words, there's no limit to the audience, and the communication has potential to impact a wide variety of people. Sometimes they're audiences that we don't even consider. And when it's impacting other people, that definitely brings in moral and ethical implications. And students make moral and ethical decisions in lots of different realms when it comes to the digital world. For example, issues of identity. So that also relates to deception, catfishing, things like that. Issues of privacy. So is it okay to tag other people? Is it okay to share their words, to share their quotes, to retweet? There's issues of ownership. So that can relate to downloading music illegally. It can relate to things like fan fiction, like the lines are blurred when it's online. Issues of credibility, which we've talked a little bit about already. And it also relates to making sure that you are a credible source. And then lastly, issues of participation. And that basically relates to, are you interacting with others in a moral way, in a responsible way? But the problem is that students don't apply ethics to these realms very well or very consistently, and there's a reason for that. Lawrence Kohlberg identified the progression of ethical thought, and it confirms that students, children start with consequence-based thinking, which relates to, if I post this, will I get in trouble? So what kind of consequences does it have for me as an individual? Eventually, they progress to moral thinking, which relates to considering the thoughts of those around them. So if I post this, will it hurt my best friend or my mom or, my cousin's feelings? And then eventually we progress to ethical thinking, which is where we consider broader audiences. So if I post this, could it impact somebody I don't know? Could it impact a large group, society as a whole, a cause? But the issue is that it's not typically achieved until adulthood, ethical thinking. So unsurprisingly, based on that, studies show children are much more likely to interact with text by using consequence thinking. So they're self-focused. There's a blindness to the moral and ethical dimensions of their choices. And in fact, 2/3 of emerging adults were unable to even identify a moral or ethical problem when asked. So instead, they identified a personal problem, such as, should I rent this apartment if I might not be able to afford it down the line? So there's not a lot of practice and application to these ethical and moral thought processes. Making matters worse is that many studies have indicated that cognitive overload harms ethical thinking, and that's really not that surprising. But when we consider how much information our students process, how many decisions they make every day, they're not going to be able to apply ethical thinking at a high quality if there's an overload of information. And then there's been a very common and popular media literacy approach called protectionism, and it could actually be harming students' ability to think on moral and ethical levels because it focuses on how media is meaningful to children on individual levels. It encourages a lot of cause and effect thinking. If I do this, this might be a consequence. But it does little to encourage thinking outside of yourself, which is key to moral and ethical mindset. So there are ways to step in the right direction, just like before our society was driven by, the digital world. Children would rely on adults for guidance when it comes to their moral and ethical decisions. But the lack of adult presence online, because they're not familiar with that realm, is concerning because of the amount of moral and ethical decisions that are made online. Luckily, studies do confirm that teens struggle With the moral and ethical thinking adults, though, are much more likely to employ those thought processes while making decisions. So some of us are capable of doing that. And to cultivate ethics in media, there really needs to be this symbiotic relationship. Teens are strong when it comes to technological skills, but they do not have those ethical processes down. And so they do need adult guidance. So the implications for the classroom are that, unfortunately, not all adults, not all of the parents are versed in ethical decision making. So therefore, teachers really need to play their part to instill those skills. But luckily, we've been handling a lot of these concepts even before the digital world became so predominant. So, for example, students were missing sources. Students use sources to co-opt and validate their beliefs, even though they went against scientific consensus. Students didn't use information as a way to learn new things, but instead used it as a way to reassure them, to confirm their own beliefs. So we can use that to build upon our media literacy instruction. So there are some approaches that encourage critical and ethical thinking, and one of those is the critical literacy approach. So it's the theory and practice of teaching and learning in which literacy is used to promote principles of democracy, equity, and social justice. It allows students to evaluate a text for things like source, appeal, aesthetics, accuracy, location, language, and structure. All of those are really important when we're taking we want to improve ethical awareness. So there's some examples of critical literacy in the classroom. One teacher used Twitter to help her students move towards critical and ethical thinking. She did this assignment called news story analysis, where students would retweet information about an article, a contemporary article, and in their retweet, they would either challenge the text, explore the identities, or see beyond bias. And that just gets their mindset looking at a text critically within a context of ethics and morality as well. Another example, in an ELA classroom, after reading The Necklace, one teacher had her students analyze cliff notes from cliffnotes.com for the story. They searched for inaccuracies, contradictions, opinions that were stated like facts, author bias. But critical literacy can be a little difficult to implement at times, but there's other kind of a la carte ways that we can address it. So, for example, inquiry-based instruction based on really meaningful questions. So the question should relate to a couple of different things. So media literacy's purpose is to ask critical questions of media with two main areas of focus. One is to understand the entity's goals, and the other is to understand the message's impact on society and the broader audience. So that second one there really encourages students to think of how their actions and words impact others on moral and ethical levels. So if you use these as foundation to write questions, to analyze a text, that will help encourage students to think ethically and morally. The Center for Media Literacy provides 5 key questions, and I really like number 3 here, which is how might different people understand this text differently than me. It gets students to consider kind of intended audiences, but also unintended audiences, and how a text can have a broader impact than, on a small scale. There's broader scale ethical impacts. So in short, there were a lot of unforeseen ethical issues with relation to media, but there's also a lot of unique opportunities for growth. So non-traditional texts are full of things like misinformation, explicit and implicit biases, and judgments. And that might seem like a problem, but it could actually be a solution as well, because without texts like that, which challenge students, they have less to question, to analyze, and consider, and they might become complacent in their thinking. So without the challenge of ethics in media, students likely wouldn't be able to improve their ethical thought processes until later in adulthood. So we're actually getting a head start due to this problem. So ethics and new media literacy can be both a challenge and a solution, because with the challenge of ethics comes a new opportunity for growth. Not only can our students reach new levels of critical thinking, but our society might start to reclaim the concepts of morality, ethics, and truth.